Permit me, if you will, a small history lesson. This is Mr. Jack Webb, a prolific radio and TV producer of the mid-20th century. Now, even if you don't recognize his name, chances are you'll recognize the title of his most famous work, a police drama that aired on NBC radio and television throughout the 1950s called Dragnet, which Webb produced, wrote, directed, and of course starred in as the iconic Sergeant Joe Friday. In 1967, a few years after the show's original run ended, Dragnet returned to television. And while the revival didn't last quite as long as the original, it obviously did something right, as this time it spawned a spin-off entitled Adam 12, which premiered in 1968 and basically followed the same police procedural format as Dragnet, except it focused on patrol officers rather than detectives. Adam 12 had a good 7-year run, but in 1972 it gave rise to its own spin-off. But this new show wasn't a police drama. Instead, it focused on 2 members of the Los Angeles Fire Department, who were also members of the paramedic program, something which was, at the time, a brand new concept in the field of emergency rescue. The show was titled, appropriately enough, Emergency.
Much like Dragnet and Adam 12 before it, the format for each episode of Emergency was fairly formulaic. The paramedics would get a call that someone somewhere was in need of urgent medical assistance, so they would rush to the scene, administer whatever first aid they could under guidance from the staff of Rampart General Hospital, take the patient to said hospital if necessary, then return to headquarters to lather, rinse, and repeat for the show's hour-long runtime, with bits of character-based subplot sprinkled in for good measure.
Emergency was a great show. My wife and I loved to watch it on Netflix. That is until Netflix decided to take leave of their senses and get rid of it, but that's neither here nor there. The point is, as good as the show may have been, was there enough to it to base a board game on it? Well, in 1973, or 1974 depending on what part of the game you look at, Milton-Bradley gave it a try.
Looking at the box art, we can see the first sign of what is basically a recurring problem, or at least a potential problem, with the Emergency game. Most of the cover is dominated by a painting depicting firemen living up to their title, and even though one of the firemen's helmets as well as the engine in the background display the number 51, which is the number of the fire station where the paramedics worked in the show, you wouldn't be able to discern any real, tangible connection to the show, were it not for the presence of actual images of the cast. As we peek inside the box and gaze upon the game's very few pieces, it's much the same story. Much of the inside of the box is taken up by a spinner, which doesn't really need to take up as much space as it does. I feel like the only reason it is this big is so it can accommodate yet more pictures from the show, and these are already on the box art, so what's the point of them? In my particular copy, the spinner was hiding even more classic TV goodness, as when we lift it up, hey, look, I got a free MASH toy! Oh, no, it's just the remains of a package. Oh well.
What little space there is in the box that isn't taken up by the spinner has these 3 container sections, 2 of which hold a deck of cards, which will either give you an emergency situation along with a location on the board to travel to, or will simply say hospital, while the third contains these 4 player tokens, each molded in the shape of a fire engine. I'm not really sure why the game makers chose a fire engine to be the player token, and indeed it speaks to the issue I spoke of earlier about there being little connection to the show. Yes, fire engines are most definitely emergency vehicles, and there's even a fire engine in Station 51, but the paramedics never drove the fire engine. Instead, their vehicle was a specially modified truck referred to as a squad, which had compartments filled with various pieces of medical equipment.
The spinner, cards, and player pieces are all hidden under the game's board, a bifold map of Los Angeles, complete with a hospital, 4 fire stations which serve as the home base for each player, and several different points of interest, all connected by a network of streets. The streets themselves are comprised of the spaces on which your player token travels. The flimsy, near lack of connection to the Emergency TV show continues on the board, with a few still images being practically the only sign that the game and the show have anything to do with each other. And while one of the HQ areas is labeled as Station 51, the paramedics' base of operations, this just gets confused by the fact that all 4 bases have images of the Station 51 paramedics, or in one case, the station itself. The hospital on the board is just some generic-looking hospital, and it's simply labeled as such. It's not even referred to as Rampart, the name of the hospital in the show.
As for instructions, while this game does have them, of course, they don't come in the form of a manual. Instead, they're printed on the inside of the box. The instructions get across all the basic points you need to know about the game, but There were a few situations my wife and I came across in our playthroughs that weren't touched on and probably should have been. We'll get more into that later, but for now, let's move on to setup and playing the game.
Setting up the game is as simple as it gets. Just shuffle the 2 card decks together and place the cards next to the board. Pick your token and place it at the appropriately colored fire station. Then flick the spinner to determine playing order.
You begin your turn by drawing an emergency card from the deck. If you draw a hospital card, then you put it off to the side and you keep drawing until you get an emergency card. I'll get into the hospital cards in a bit. The emergency card will have a description of some kind of an emergency situation as well as a location on the board to travel to. To complete the assignment, you must proceed to the destination listed on the card, then return to headquarters. And once back there, you place the emergency card somewhere on the side of the board near your headquarters. The instructions seem to want you to actually place them on headquarters, but there's not really that much room. Then on your next turn, you draw another emergency card and start the whole thing over. The first player to complete 3 emergency assignments wins.
Now, of course, it's not just a simple matter of go there and come back. Firstly, your turn length is obviously dictated by the spinner, and the different emergency locations are placed such that it's highly unlikely you'll get there in one turn unless you get a string of spin-agains on the spinner.
Although, as we found out in our playthrough, that's far from impossible.
But secondly, as I alluded to earlier, the board is laid out just like a network of streets, complete with all the traffic rules you might expect. On 2-way streets, you must stick to the right side of the road, unless you're passing another player. If you come across a stop sign, you have to stop, regardless of whether or not you've moved the full amount from your spin. If you're on a single-lane street and another player happens to be blocking your path to an emergency location, you cannot pass that player, and instead must find an alternate route.
And on top of all that, there's also one other minor complication: the hospital cards. And I say minor because when it comes to their execution, I don't think they come off as the encumbrances that perhaps they were meant to be.
You see, if you've drawn a hospital card, then once you've reached an emergency location, you must proceed from there to the hospital, and once there, turn in the hospital card. If you have multiple hospital cards, then you only deposit 1 and hold on to the extras for future assignments. Also, if you land on a space occupied by another player, you can give that player one of your extra hospital cards, forcing that player to go there for his assignment. You can't do this, however, if you only have 1 hospital card.
Where the problem lies is that once you've gotten to the hospital and deposited your hospital card, you can then deposit your emergency card at your headquarters without having to actually travel back there yourself. Then, in what the instructions refer to as receiving a, quote, radio message, you can then start your next turn by drawing another emergency card while still at the hospital. Now, this is entirely show accurate. There have been some instances on the show where the paramedics would receive an emergency call while at the hospital and would proceed from there to the location. However, it didn't always happen that way, as more often than not, after restocking any supplies they might need, the paramedics would simply head back to the station. This could have easily been translated to the game by requiring you to go to the hospital, deposit your hospital card, then return to your HQ and deposit the emergency card. And you could maybe have a few hospital cards also say radio message, indicating that in that instance, you could start your next turn by drawing an emergency card from the hospital. My main problem with the game was that I bought it as a fan of emergency and was severely disappointed with what little connection there was to the show. But even if you take the show's connection out of the equation and treat this as its own game involving paramedics and emergency rescue, the emergency game is still very problematic. For one thing, a game moves by entirely too quickly. Now, part of that comes down to just how many spin-again spaces there are on the spinner and just how easy it seems to be to land on one. The other factor is, well, the emergencies themselves. Once you get to an emergency location, that's it. All you have to do is wait for your next turn, or at least I think you do, I'll get to that in a bit, before going back to either the hospital or the headquarters.
The scale of the emergencies on the show were wide and varied. Sometimes it was a huge brush fire that would take days to get under control. Other times, someone would be having a heart attack, or start going into labor. Or sometimes all it is a kid that got stuck in some handcuffs and all you need is a pair of pliers.
I think it would have helped the game if each emergency card required you to stay at that particular location for a set amount of turns, or perhaps had you roll 2 even numbers in a row, or 3 sixes, or perform some other such skill check in order to be able to pass, for lack of a better term, that emergency.
Lastly, there's the game's instructions, which only cover the bare minimum amount of what you need to know to play the game.
But far too often in our playthroughs, my wife and I decided to just wing it when we would come across a situation that wasn't described in the instructions. Let me give you a few examples. The instructions say you don't need to reach an emergency location or your HQ by exact count. But what happens when you do get there? Does your turn end right then and there? Or if you spun a 6 and you got to an emergency location in 2 moves, can you then use the remaining 4 immediately to start heading back to HQ? Even if your turn does end, what if you spun a spin again? Does that still take effect? Speaking of headquarters, each one has this tiny little space in front of it. Now, obviously it's there to let you know how to enter it, so you don't just hop into HQ from anywhere around it, but beyond that, does it count as a normal space? It's not quite as big as one, and it's not split into 2 like most of the streets, but it's still big enough to be noticeable and make you wonder. And again, if you get to HQ with moves left over, does your turn end right there? Does a spin again still take effect? What is the point of having a rule saying that you must drive on the right side of the road? Is it like Uno, where if you get caught driving on the left side and they call you out, you're penalized? There's no penalty mentioned in the instructions. In fact, as I said, there's a lot of things that aren't mentioned in the instructions, and I really wish they could have been just that much more specific. Basically, whether you look at the game as something connected to emergency or just a normal board game, the emergency game falls flat in just about every way possible. And I think even the $10 I paid for it at the local antique store is just a bit too much, to say nothing of the average price on eBay of around $21. And so ends another glimpse into board game Obscura. I hope you found it at least somewhat informative and enjoyable, and that you'll join me next time. Jikai mare. Sayonara.